What if the real struggle for Ukraine's future is not happening in the ruins of bombed cities, but in shadows, whispered in corridors, hidden behind carefully curated images, and unfolding in the quiet spaces where hope turns to doubt? What if the outcome is being decided not by the thunder of artillery, but by the slow, almost invisible erosion of trust, resilience, and the very fabric of society? For nearly a decade, the world has watched Ukraine's agony and defiance with a mix of awe and dread. We are told stories of unbreakable will, a nation of 40 million standing tall against overwhelming odds, echoing the legendary sieges of history. The images of resistance are everywhere. A grandmother clutching a flag in Kharkiv, volunteers stacking sandbags in Odessa, soldiers sharing bread in the glow of a campfire. These are the stories that fill our screens and shape our perceptions. But beneath the surface, a quieter, more troubling narrative unfolds. Speak with those working in the margins, doctors in threadbare hospitals, teachers in collapsing schools, aid workers negotiating black market checkpoints, and another story emerges. It is not just one of hardship, but of fatigue, of growing cynicism, of a system fraying with every new day, every new loss, every new promise that goes unfulfilled. The contrast is jarring. Between the official briefings that celebrate heroism and the whispered admissions of despair, between news feeds displaying stirring images of resistance and the whispered confessions among soldiers that the next shipment of ammo may never arrive. This is the story of a country living in two realities at once. On one side, the spectacle of resilience, a brittle mask for institutions at the edge of breakdown. On the other, a reality where politicians and commanders repeat hollow slogans, but even their most loyal followers see the fissures beneath, where corruption poisons recruitment offices and supply chains, and battlefield strategy gives way to last-ditch improvisation. If you accept the official narrative, you risk missing the deeper collapse, social, economic, and moral. This is no longer a matter of shifting front lines or which city falls next. It is a society being pushed to the point of breaking by a war it cannot sustain. It is the slow unraveling of not just an army, but an entire system, exposed in real time. So what are we witnessing? Is this the final heroic stand, the stuff of legends, like the defense of Leningrad or the Warsaw Uprising? Or is it the slow, painful unraveling of a dream, as happened in Saigon or Kabul, when the world looked away just long enough for hope to collapse? To understand how this unraveling became possible, we need to look beyond the headlines and examine the fractures within Ukraine's war effort. The cracks are not new. They have been widening since the earliest days of the conflict, since the Revolution of Dignity, since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, since the first volunteer battalions were formed with little more than enthusiasm and borrowed rifles. But they have grown into chasms as the war has dragged on. Consider Ukraine's defensive lines. Once hailed as unbreakable, fortified with trenches, anti-tank barriers, and the dogged determination of defenders, they now show signs of unraveling. The language of victory, which once filled presidential speeches and international summits, is fading fast. In the east, cities such as Avdiivka and Pokrovsk are falling in succession. Russian advances are not just steady, they are crushing, overwhelming Ukrainian units already stretched to their limits. The front, once marked by stubborn hope, has become a map of retreat and irretrievable loss. The story is echoed in the words of Western analysts. 12 months ago, they spoke of counteroffensives and breakthroughs, comparing Ukraine's determination to the British during the Blitz or the Finns during the Winter War. Now their tone is tinged with resignation and quiet alarm. Headlines that once promised turning points now warn of battles entering their final phase. Phrases like apogee of the assault and delaying tactics have replaced vows to reclaim lost ground. Even Kiev's official statements have shifted from steel-eyed defiance, the enemy will not pass, to the blunt language of tactical withdrawals and emergency regroupings. These are not just words. They are telltale signs of a system under unbearable strain. Desperation now drives the tactics on the ground. Ukrainian forces, depleted and cornered, unleash kamikaze drones in urban strongholds, risking everything on maneuvers that feel more frantic than strategic. In fractured city streets and battered trenches, hope is surrendered to raw improvisation and fleeting bursts of violence. The echoes of Stalingrad, Grozny, and Aleppo are hard to ignore. Logistics are stretched past the breaking point. Ammunition, vehicles, and fresh recruits are vanishing faster than they can be replaced. Western shipments, when they arrive at all, are often late or consist of worn-out equipment disguised as modern aid. The official narrative of resilience barely conceals a reality of exhaustion and systemic breakdown, a situation reminiscent of the closing years of the Vietnam War, when supply lines ran dry and morale collapsed even as generals spoke of victory. Each day, the divide grows wider between the heroic slogans given to the public and the grim truths whispered at the front. The price of believing in mantras like "hold the line" is paid in blood, wasted resources, and mounting despair. Clinging to the illusion of control only delays the brutal reckoning that awaits, as happened in the final months of the Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan. Yet this war is no longer just about shifting lines or lost territory. Behind the chaos, new battles are taking shape. Fierce contests in the realms of politics and economics that will decide Ukraine's fate long after the last trench is abandoned. The struggle for survival now extends far beyond the battlefield. But even as the world watches the front collapse, another crisis is erupting from within. The machinery of mobilization, once a source of unity and national pride, like the call to arms in Britain during the Second World War, is now corroded by distrust, corruption, and fear. It is a machine that no longer inspires, but terrifies. Sanctions, oil flows, and diplomatic dances. When the West tries to punish Russia, who truly pays the price? The United States, with its Western allies in tow, unleashes a sweeping new round of sanctions meant to strangle Russia's economy. The targets are massive: oil titans like Rosneft and Lukoil, plus dozens of affiliated firms. The goal is clear: freeze assets, stop revenues, and destabilize Moscow's war machine, just as sanctions were once levied against Iraq or Iran to bring rogue regimes to heel. Yet the reality is more slippery. Russia absorbs the blow, but it is a bruise, not a break. Oil still pours out, rerouted through a tangled network of intermediaries, shadow fleets, and sympathetic ports. Tankers swap flags, paperwork vanishes into offshore havens, and the same barrels often reach the same buyers, just with inflated costs and murkier trails. This echoes the oil-for-food schemes of the 1990s, when sanctions intended to halt Saddam Hussein's regime ended up enriching black marketeers and foreign middlemen. India, now among the world's largest buyers of Russian oil, speaks of peace and international law while quietly doubling its imports. In Europe, leaders denounce Moscow in daylight, but behind closed doors, exploit loopholes and backdoor deals to keep lights on and factories alive. When jobs and energy security are at risk, pragmatism quietly trumps moral outrage, as it did during the Suez Crisis or the OPEC oil embargoes of the 1970s. Inside European capitals, the debate heats up. Should the West seize Russia's frozen billions to fund Ukraine's defense and reconstruction? Legal experts warn of chaos and precedent, fearing a repeat of the asset seizures that followed the Iranian Revolution, which led to decades of litigation. Leaders weigh the ethics of confiscation against their own citizens' rising bills and fraying patience. Ironically, the pain intended for Moscow circles back on the West. Energy markets convulse with volatility, pushing up prices for families and businesses. Politicians face angry protests, sagging approval ratings, and a public growing tired of economic sacrifice for a distant war. Economic warfare becomes a test not just of policy, but of social cohesion and political will at home, the same dynamic that forced American withdrawal from Vietnam amid mounting domestic unrest. Misreading who pays and who profits from this economic fight brings real risks: misguided policies, wasted taxpayer money, and mounting disillusionment. As sanctions morph and oil keeps moving, the myth of simple punishment crumbles, exposing another layer of global gamesmanship. The lessons of past sanctions, whether against Cuba, North Korea, or apartheid South Africa, are clear. Economic warfare is rarely clean or predictable, and often hurts those least able to bear it. As the economic battle lines blur, the reality on the front grows even starker. The war's costs, human, financial, and moral, are mounting, and the consequences ripple far beyond the battlefield. When survival turns into spectacle, what happens when people's suffering becomes currency? This is no longer only a story of front lines and battles. Behind the headlines, Ukraine faces a growing catastrophe at home. Government money may run dry by the end of the first quarter of 2026, threatening hospitals, schools, and the most basic services. For families already barely hanging on, the countdown has begun. The stories echo the worst days of Greece's debt crisis, when school budgets vanished and hospitals rationed care. Desperate plans are emerging. Officials are considering delaying or even canceling heating restoration across the southeast. Not just to save funds, but to make hardship unmistakable, hoping images of shivering children and desperate families will jolt Western politicians and audiences into action. In this cruel calculus, pain is a tool. But the truth is grimmer still. Ukraine's infrastructure has grown so brittle that hospitals, water plants, and city shelters go without the backup generators that were once promised. Corruption and negligence have drained the coffers, leaving entire neighborhoods exposed as the cold deepens. The safety net is torn and frayed, and no one remains to repair it. A similar fate befell Lebanon after its civil war, and even today, electricity and water are luxuries rather than guarantees. This is how a humanitarian emergency is manufactured. Stage-managed, broadcasted, its agony weaponized to stir up sympathy and aid from abroad. The suffering is real, yet it is curated for maximum effect. The more harrowing the scenes, the more likely international help will follow. The playbook is not new. It was seen during the Balkan Wars, when harrowing footage moved world powers to act, but also sometimes to cynicism and fatigue. Ordinary Ukrainians pay the real price. They endure freezing homes, exploding costs, and endless forms for aid that almost never comes. Each week, their misery is paraded across screens, easy to witness, nearly impossible to fix. The situation echoes the worst moments of the Syrian conflict, when refugees became both victims and bargaining chips in a wider geopolitical game. When disaster is wielded as a bargaining chip, trust withers. Victims become props, and real solutions slip further away. Compassion and manipulation blur into each other, leaving everyone, victims and donors alike, feeling exploited. The cycle of suffering and sympathy becomes its own trap. Nowhere is this erosion of trust and humanity more evident than in Ukraine's mobilization system. The machinery of conscription, once seen as a backbone of national defense, is now mired in scandal and fear. What happens when those meant to protect are themselves desperate to escape? What if today's most lucrative business in Ukraine is not selling goods or services, but selling escape from war? Mobilization, once wrapped in patriotic language, has mutated into a shadow industry worth billions of euros every single year. This is no longer about defending the nation. It is now a feverish gold rush fueled by bribery, forged papers, and secret deals, as families scramble to keep their loved ones far from the trenches, no matter the price. Some bribe officials for fake medical exemptions. Others buy counterfeit documents or pay smugglers to sneak draft-age men across borders. A new word has emerged: buzzification. Organized bus routes, once for daily commutes, now clandestinely ferry desperate passengers from Ukraine to safety. These buses, packed with anxious men, are the new lifeboats, symbols of an era where escape means survival. The phenomenon recalls the mass exoduses during the Yugoslav wars, when people paid fortunes to flee conscription. Official reports boast high quotas and long lists of mobilized names. But behind these statistics, the reality is surreal. By some estimates, as many as half of those supposedly drafted never reach military units. They vanish, shielded by bribes, erased by paperwork, or absorbed into the vast underground economy. The draft itself becomes a money machine for insiders and black market fixers. In some regions, entire villages have emptied of young men. At the core of this system is a collapse of trust. The military bureaucracy is obsessed with filling out spreadsheets, not battle lines. Success is measured in numbers, never mind if the ranks are padded with the unwilling, the unfit, or the unprepared. The army's fighting strength withers, even as the paperwork claims victory. This echoes the last years of the Soviet army in Afghanistan, when conscription became a nightmare to be avoided at all costs. Meanwhile, the privileged and powerful rush to shield themselves from real risk. Their sons and brothers are kept well away from danger. The burden falls on the poor, the rural, and the unlucky, those with no money, no connections, and no escape, left to fill the trenches against their will. The dynamic is as old as war itself, from the Roman Republic to the American Civil War, when the wealthy could buy their way out of harm's way. Ukraine's defense system, once a point of pride, is now a stage for fraud, fear, and exploitation. If the legitimacy of the army, and the nation's very security, can be bought and sold, what does that reveal about those truly in charge? It reveals a system where loyalty is replaced by calculation, and duty by desperation. This is not just a Ukrainian problem. When a nation's war effort becomes a marketplace for survival, the consequences ripple far beyond its borders. Neighboring countries face waves of refugees, while criminal networks grow rich off misery. The same patterns played out in Syria, in Afghanistan, and in Central America, fueling instability for years to come. When war becomes a spectacle, the first casualty is not measured in territory or soldiers, it is the truth itself. While the world obsesses over shifting front lines and the thunder of missiles, something even more corrosive unfolds beneath the headlines. Quietly, trust unravels. Not just in governments or armies, but in every statement and every promise that claims to reveal the real story. In Ukraine, the war has become a stage. Narratives are crafted, desperation is disguised as resilience, and every side markets its own brand of hope or catastrophe. The devastation in ruined streets is undeniable, but there is another, subtler ruin, the decay of honesty. Politicians scramble to seize the narrative, rebranding disasters as tactical plans and concealing collapse behind patriotic spectacle. Pressured by public appetites and official lines, media outlets amplify these stories, flattening complex realities into simple tales of good and evil. The result is not understanding, but confusion, a fog of misinformation, wishful thinking, and denial that thickens with every broadcast. This corrosion reaches beyond the battlefield. When trust is hollowed out, even the most sincere support begins to ring empty. People start to doubt not only the facts, but one another. Suspicion replaces cooperation, and solidarity buckles under the weight of disappointment. Donors grow wary. Volunteers burn out. Ordinary citizens, from Kiev to London to New York, are left questioning whom to believe. In a world where information is as potent as artillery, the defense of truth becomes the front line we cannot afford to lose. The gravest illusion is not that victory is assured or defeat unthinkable. It is the belief that the truth no longer matters. Accepting easy, comforting stories breeds fresh disasters, wasted aid, failed strategies, and cycles of violence that repeat and deepen. It allows those in power to dodge accountability, spinning blame as suffering multiplies. When we turn away from difficult realities, we become complicit in the machinery that traps those we hope to save. This moment demands more than sympathy or outrage. It demands honesty. We must insist on real accounting, demand uncomfortable answers, and resist the temptation of the story that feels best. Only by facing the facts, however harsh or tangled, can we offer meaningful support or push for genuine solutions. The future depends not on slogans or spectacle, but on our willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, to question what we are told, and to reject entertainment in place of understanding. So what can be done, in practice, to begin mending the fractures and restoring some measure of hope? The first, and perhaps hardest, is to acknowledge the depth of the crisis. For Ukraine's leaders, this means a break with performative politics, admitting failures, rooting out corruption, and putting transparency above optics. When Finland faced existential threat during the Winter War, its government admitted hard truths to its people, forging a unity that outlasted defeat on the battlefield. Second, Ukraine's Western partners must demand accountability for every euro and dollar cent. Aid must be conditional on reforms, as was done with the Marshall Plan after the Second World War. This means supporting independent watchdogs, protecting journalists and whistleblowers, and refusing to look away from uncomfortable reports. As history shows, foreign support can sustain a nation, but only if it strengthens, not supplants, domestic legitimacy. Third, the mobilization system must be rebuilt on fairness, not fear. Draft evasion is a symptom, not the disease. Real reform means transparent procedures, equal burden sharing, and care for veterans and families. Israel, which has faced existential threats for decades, has built systems, imperfect but far fairer, for national service, with broad buy-in and real oversight. Fourth, the humanitarian emergency must be met with more than images. International agencies and NGOs must partner with local groups to deliver aid directly, bypassing corrupt intermediaries whenever possible. The lessons of Bosnia and Rwanda are clear. When aid becomes a spectacle, it loses effectiveness and breeds resentment. Finally, in the information war, the defense of truth must become a priority. This means supporting independent media, fostering critical thinking, and helping citizens distinguish between propaganda and reporting. Poland's post-communist transformation was built on a foundation of open debate and fact-based journalism, the same tools Ukraine will need to rebuild trust. None of these steps are easy. Each requires sacrifice, courage, and a willingness to confront failure head-on. But history shows that societies can recover from disaster if they are honest about the scale of the challenge and if they refuse to trade truth for comfort. Because when war is performed for the world, the real battle is for our perception, and the cost of losing is greater than any defeat on the ground. The story of Ukraine is not over. Its fate will not be decided solely by armies or politicians, but by the choices made in the shadows, behind the headlines, and in the hearts of those still willing to believe that honesty, even in ruin, is a kind of victory.